It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's session of the Aberdeen and Bonn Global Conversations, hosted by my colleague and friend Ulrich Schlie, who will soon, of course, also take over. But first, I'd like to welcome our guest for today, Sir Paul Tucker. So Paul Tucker obviously does not need no introduction, but it would be impolite not to introduce him, so I will introduce him anyway. Sir Paul is, of course, a British economist, a central banker, and an author. He's now best known for his work at Harvard Kennedy School, where he is, but he's also senior fellow at Harvard Center for European Studies. His career started a long time ago at Trinity College, Cambridge, and he then pursued a long career in central banking, where he served, amongst so many other posts, as the deputy governor of the Bank of England. Paul was also, between 2015 and 2021, the chair of the Systemic Risk Council. In November 2018, he was elected president of the UK's National Institute for Economic and Social Research. He was, of course, also knighted in 2014 for his services to central banking. He is now the author of 2 books. His first book, Unelected Power: The Quest for Legitimacy in Central Banking and the Regulatory State, was published in May 2018 by Princeton University Press. And his second book, about which we of course talk today, Global Discourse, was published in November. And it is really about this book that we would like to discuss with Paul Tucker, because it is of course such a topical book to try to see how the world can be governed, how a global discord can be governed, and whether that is actually possible at a time at which we realize that maybe the post-1990s dream of a liberal world order where everyone plays by the rules has turned into an illusion. How can this world be governed, and how can we as liberal Western states participate that without losing our core values? So that is really what I'd like to discuss. Also, for those of you who are new to the Aberdeen and Bonn Global Conversations, this is supposed to be really as interactive a format as possible, where we generally start with a chat between the speaker and I, but then really very quickly encourage the involvement by everyone. So this is not the kind of session where people speak for the first hour and a half, and then there is time for interviews for questions for 5 seconds. So without any further ado, welcome, Paul, and can you tell us, maybe in a nutshell, how global discord can be governed?
With great difficulty. I mean, I wrote this book because when I looked at international cooperation, and I was kind of involved in various international groups and regimes in the distant past now, it was obvious to me that most international cooperation takes for granted some background order that maintains peaceful coexistence. And this is kind of problematic because we've lived under the prevailing order for so long that kind of elemental fact, as I'd like to describe it, had been overlooked. And you see that in kind of the siloism among different policy fields, both domestically and internationally. Whereas in fact, the background order can't be taken for granted, and at the moment, of course, is contested. For what it's worth, I have thought for a long time, including when I was in office, which is more than a decade ago, that I think this contest will go on for decades and decades. I mean, quite possibly a century or more, and that it will be kind of everywhere and in everything. It's different in that respect from the old Cold War, and is deeply ideological, which in some respects makes it different from the contest between my country and the Second Reich at the turn of the 20th century. And I think the kind of vital things are, if one has that slightly pessimistic view, are peaceful coexistence and holding on to our way of life. And so this is a much less ambitious of international relations and international cooperation than people have flirted with over recent decades. I'm not a kind of internationalist in the kind of jargony sense of international relations. Indeed, further than that, I think the kind of core of the book, in a way, its high-level contribution, if there is one, is that I don't think we can find an answer to our predicament in either a kind of Hobbesian style realism or a Kantian style. And the intellectual heart of the book is recruiting David Hume and Bernard Williams, the late 20th century moral philosopher, to kind of generate a kind of more modest that is focused more on peaceful coexistence and maintaining all legitimacy whilst not ruling out the possibility of cooperation among states of different kinds. The ultimate model is one of concentric circles, but we might come to that.
So how is peace? So go ahead. Okay, so but how is then peaceful coexistence possible at a time at which things seem to be moving into an age of conflict? So, for instance, I suppose if you look at Western European countries, or European countries, North America, countries like India, Latin America, it's easy to make that kind of argument. But how would you make the argument with regards to countries like Russia and other countries that clearly do not seem to have any interest in that kind of peaceful coexistence?
Well, in a sense, they put themselves beyond the pale. They put themselves beyond any conception of concentric circles of cooperation, and therefore I have supported the Western world's approach to backing Ukraine. And actually, this goes back to, the realist contribution to this years ago was it's a great mistake to push membership of NATO forward or eastward, because it will raise the probability of conflict. Typically, full stop. But any kind of simple, robust analysis weighs both probability and impact. Because it's quite possible that we did probability of conflict by pushing NATO expansion eastwards, but reduced the impact of conflict if that probability crystallized. And in fact, I think that's where we are. I think if all of those Central and European states had not been part of NATO, we would be in a worse position. Now, there's a great kind of lesson in that for analysts of any kind of policy world, of thinking about probabilities and about the costs, the worst plausible costs of those probabilities crystallizing. This is what economists call minimax. Minimize the maximum costs of plausible but unlikely states of the world. And Russia is just in a place where we need to contain them as far as we possibly can, because that is in our long-term interests.
Would you, in a way, I'm slightly moving out of the territory of your book, but only slightly so, because in a way, my next question is really about where in the world we can expect the arguments of your book to work. So in other words, as you've just said yourself, it wouldn't work, at least at the moment, with regards to Russia. But are you saying that what's happening in Russia, while requiring containment, is and deterrence, I suppose, is unlikely to spread further in the world? It is unlikely to become the defining feature of the international system, and that therefore we can actually pursue the kind of coexistence with the rest of the world that you are that you're making a case for?
I think the first thing to say is I don't think that the Russian case is the argument of the book failing. I think it's an example of the argument of the book succeeding, in that we should face up to the possibility that some people will put themselves beyond the pale and shouldn't indulge in wishful thinking about that. I mean, one of the things I have in common with international relations realists, going back to Thucydides, in the text of Thucydides, but he conveys it, is an allergy to wishful thinking of any kind. I think peaceful coexistence doesn't mean that we should, with states, great powers that also, however reluctantly, seek peaceful coexistence. We have to calibrate very carefully, and they have to calibrate very carefully the degree of cooperation that entails. So that I have been an advocate of what is now called de-risking, or reducing overdependence and vulnerabilities in this, most obviously, to the People's Republic. But I think that is symmetric. I don't think that's an anti-Beijing thing. I think it is in their interests to reduce overdependence on us. And there's no doubt that that risks overshooting and impoverishing the world. But nor should the risk be overstated. About 6 months or so ago, the head of the IMF said that it was extraordinary that the de-risking that had gone on already was going to take, I think it was 1.5 trillion of global GDP, which by any standards sounds like an enormous number. But actually, it's about 1 to 1.5% of global GDP. And if the world grows at only 3% a year, and typically it's grown at rather more than that, that's about 6 months' growth. And if you said, well, actually, would it be worth paying 6 months' growth at the level of the world as an insurance policy to reduce vulnerabilities and therefore contribute to reducing the probability of conflict? I would say yes. That's kind of quite a small to pay out 6 months of global growth. But that doesn't deny that there is a risk that the process of de-risking, as it works through domestic politics in the main capitals, will end up with, broadly speaking, unnecessary de-risking that actually doesn't reduce risks. It just makes everybody poorer. And that just demands, I mean, the awkward thing, in a sense, is that it demands a quality of governance in the main capitals that hasn't been in stark display over recent decades.
So how do we change that?
I think a necessary condition for changing it is to recognize this point about silos. Let me give you an example, which is from my old world. There was a moment in the global financial crisis. I think I was deputy governor by this point, and somebody walked into my room and said, the Federal Reserve, the United States Central Bank, has just refused India a swap line. No one on this call needs to know what a swap line is. It's just a line of credit from one country to another, where you take the other country's currency as collateral. So this person walks into my room and says, the Federal Reserve have refused India a swap line. And my response was, don't they realize India is going to be a power? In a sense, I thought it was above the pay grade of the bosses of the Federal Reserve that this was a foreign policy thing, and that taking a medium to long term view, it wasn't sensible to irritate. Irritated they were, or at least if you were going to do that, you need to do something else from the White House, the State Department, whatever, which addresses that and kind of mitigates it in some way and comes to their help in some way rather than a kind of signal of you're on your own, mate. Now, actually, all of this was undone, of course, by the border skirmish with China in 2020. History will quite possibly look back on as the most important event in 2020, that rather than the pandemic. And as someone that had COVID rather badly, I don't say that lightly.
Thanks. I suppose you're making a case here, both in terms of intellectually on how the system has to be structured, also about how we need to persuade policymakers to buy into these ideas of silos and so on, that we need higher quality governance, I suppose. These are, of course, already all arguments that are, I guess, addressed at our own governments. But how do you address, for instance, China, or rather, I mean, not you personally, but I mean, how do you make the case to to the Chinese? Have you actually, by the way, have you already had any responses to the book from China? So you of course make an intellectual case for constrained pluralism in your book. Which in a way is an argument that comes out of the history of Western thought as you develop it, and now you want to apply it to China. So how do you convince the Chinese that something that you have developed based on Western ideas is something that they should go for?
Well, I think the greatest priority actually is to convey the message as well to non-Western states that in some degree are constitutional democracies. The book ends on a note that the Confucian heritage constitutional democracies, South Korea, Japan, a few others, kind of don't quite hold the world in their hand, players, or actors, because their very existence and modern politics means that you can be a constitutional democracy without losing your self-history, and so since ideas that happen to begin in the West are no longer distinctly Western, and I mean, I think that's tremendously important. But concretely, let me give an example where international organizations make things more difficult rather than opening doors. So many of the people on the video will know, some perhaps won't, will know about the state subsidies case that China took to the WTO about more than a decade ago. And roughly it was this. No one denies the fact that Chinese state-owned enterprises are involved in helping other Chinese businesses compete on a subsidized basis in world markets. And crudely, Washington said, you can't do that. Those are illegal subsidies, illegal under the WTO treaty, and therefore you need to stop, or we will impose tariffs, countervailing measures that offset the benefit of the subsidies. And Beijing replied, actually the subsidies aren't illegal, and therefore it would be illegal for you to claim that you could put countermeasures in place. They go around that a bit. It goes to the WTO dispute process through the panel up to the appellate board, and the appellate board concluded in favor of the Chinese that actually, although these were subsidies, they weren't illegal state subsidies, because the proper interpretation of the term public body to mean something roughly like central government didn't actually include state-owned enterprises. So this is an extraordinary decision in some respects. And in just like the US Supreme Court, I think the appellate body was just out of its depth. The interesting bit is what comes next, that in what you would expect in many circumstances would be that something like that the case would be decided, and then Washington and Beijing would sit down and say, we can't possibly go on like this. And we need a rule change. And we need a rule change that where China ends up giving up some of its gains, and the United States and Europe end up recouping some of their forward-looking losses. And if those talks went tolerably well, this is a world of diplomacy and bargaining, not of law, others would eventually come to the table, probably Japan, probably the EU as the other great trading blocs, and there'd be some kind of accommodation where nobody felt quite what they felt before, but things could move on, and there would be a rule change. This is what happens in domestic politics. But of course, actually, there's no prospect of there being a rule change, because absolutely everybody has a veto over the WTO rules. This is a big difference in the GATT, WTO. So the WTO, the terms of the WTO treaty before China entered, there's a separate set of arguments about the terms of Chinese entry. But, treaty itself kind of is essentially cast as though two things are true. One is that you can draft the perfect treaty because actually you know it's going to be impossible to change it. Well, that's crazy. And secondly, much more importantly, is that although illiberal states that don't have the same attitudes to trade, actually none of those illiberal states is ever going to be big. That there will be kind of small problems which don't really matter at the level of the world trading system. But that what can't happen is, this is an end of history type blindness, what can't happen is the emergence of a vast superpower that doesn't have the same attitudes to subsidies and the role of the state in commerce. You see the same thought process in Rawls's Laws of Peoples, which in many respects I think is his best book. And he talks about liberal and decent peoples and other types of state or peoples, but including kind of benighted peoples in some way. But all the problematic states in Rawls's setup are none of them can be big. And what matters here is that not only is the international system that rules cast in the image of the Western world, as you're putting it, but actually it's kind of it's cast and locked up in that it doesn't even have the flexibility to make ongoing repairs to accommodate the rise of a new power. We're seeing this with the IMF now. The managing director has made a speech that implying there should be quota reform. Well, there isn't going to be quota reform, and it loses veto, and China or something like that. Our international organizations, many of them, so, are in a kind of incipient crisis, which the leaders of those organizations are very sensibly ignoring, because there's absolutely nothing they can do about it. They have to carry on talking as though the world hasn't changed, even though it has changed. And somehow the conversation between Washington and Beijing about that. But I don't see that the conditions for that conversation exist until there has been, broadly speaking, enough risk of decoupling for them to turn to lesser things. Because this is a lesser thing.
Yep. Thanks so much. I think and we should probably return to the idea of how to, or the challenge of how to bring about risk decoupling in a minute. But first, I'd like to also give my my co-host Ulrich Schlie a chance to either respond or to ask questions.
So also a warm welcome from a sunny day in Bonn in West Germany. Thank you for joining in and sharing your views. I have to admit that I haven't read the book so far, and will do everything to spread it here over in Bonn, and would be most happy to host you here in Bonn as well. My question would go in the direction to ask you to look a bit ahead and try to digest already the reactions given to your book so far from the different corners, so from international organizations, but also as it has been Would you have you had any reactions from China?
I haven't.
You haven't.
I haven't, but quite interesting. I've talked about it in Asia. And I'll say something about that in a moment. One thing is interesting. I mean, one of the things I say, I don't make a great deal of this in the book, is that I think many multinational companies, for partly understandable, haven't really got heads around the change in geopolitical circumstances, and crudely that they may find themselves having to choose or having choice imposed upon them. And for example, I've talked about public. The leader of the said only a few months ago that it was unthinkable to decouple from China. Well, if it's unthinkable to decouple from China, that implies that it must be thinkable to decouple from the United States, or alternatively, that he just hasn't thought about it very much, or actually just misspoke. And I mean, although that sounds a bit unkind, I think it's quite a useful thing to say. And I've had an experience in recent weeks that was interesting. I'm not going to name them, but a famous consultancy was thinking about doing an interview with me, as indeed they had on my previous book, and decided not to because it was just too sensitive for them as a business. And I think that's a useful thing to report, because I think it's indicative of how multinational companies are kind of struggle to navigate this. And I've been asked by one or two multinational companies to kind of talk to them privately about the book. I've had very strong and favorable feedback from the insides, I mean, by which I mean the very core of some Western governments, in terms of, to put it in a self-serving way. Oh, this is kind of providing a framework for kind of what we're trying to do, and it enables us to test the limits and course we're doing. And the other kind of positive feedback I've had is from trade economists. For example, Petros Mavridis at Columbia, and I think he's based in a Swiss university as well, who said, actually, there is a need for trade lawyers and trade policymakers to think through, what does the national security exemption in the treaty mean, and how can it be developed where countries are able to kind of, if I can put it broadly, kind of protect their deepest interests without getting completely out of control. I'm not sure that I've yet persuaded people, although this is my most important project, that David Hume really does offer a way between Immanuel Kant and Thomas Hobbes, which I think is intellectually the most important thing. But I think, summing up, I think the response has been, yes, there is a really big question about how do we make the world safer without absolutely impoverishing the world in the process. And by the way, I would be delighted to come to Bonn. That would be absolutely fantastic. So
yeah, we will realize that. So Bonn is still the same when you compare it with the times when it was the capital of the Federal Republic of Germany. But what you describe is interestingly in line with what I see in conversations over here with industries and world of finance. I think there is great uneasiness about the situation, and I wanted to ask you, how would you describe exactly the current point in history? So the situation in which we live, when you would,
I think that
bring it into a where are we at the moment?
Yeah, you're cutting off on the Eric, so I'm not sure I got the whole of the question, but I did get the bit about situating this in history.
Yeah.
Everybody looks at parallels. And I think that the nearest parallel
Mhm.
in Western history as it bears on the world,
Yeah.
not just in Western history narrowly, locally, is Britain and France in the long 18th century. I mean, I think this contest is characterized by it will be everywhere in everything. Neither side can easily knock out the other, and is ideological. So if you think about the old Cold War, it was everywhere, it was ideological, neither side could knock out the other, but it wasn't in everything, because Stalin had made the fateful choice to essentially withdraw from what became the dominant international economic system. So it wasn't everywhere, whereas China and everyone touch each other in international commerce, and that isn't going to go away quickly, even with de-risking, decoupling, short of outright conflict and the shutters coming down. It's not like I would say it's not like Britain and the Second Reich, which was kind of pretty well everywhere and pretty well in everything, but it wasn't deeply ideological. It was kind of more about leadership and power. It wasn't deeply about conceptions of how to govern a domestic state or the world. It was about tolerance. I think it is rather like Britain and France in the 18th century, from roughly 1680 to 1815, because that did have all of those four features. You can even think of the American independence as kind of an aspect of that. And what's really important about that, I think, is that there were phases of the 18th century where Britain and France reached accommodations. There was a trade treaty in the middle of the century sometime, and then it never really came to anything because they fell into war again. And that moment wasn't recaptured until the 1860s. And I think this is instructive. I mean, in a kind of very concrete sense. I mean, the Chinese economy is wobbling at the moment, and maybe it will do more than wobble. And I'm confident that if that happens, that people in and around Wall Street and people in and around City and the City of London and Frankfurt, so the kind of commentariat that goes beyond economics into politics, will say, oh, that's it, all over, back to normal. It was just like Japan. And I don't think it's anything like Japan. I think that as long as China, as long as the party maintains internal political stability, the party has the capacity, even with the economy moving sideways, to increase the proportion of its national output that goes into hard power, into the military, and therefore to continue becoming a dominant power. And the point here, one more sentence, Tom. What is that I don't think people have got their heads round that this isn't like the rise of Japan in the 90s or Germany's miraculous economic growth in the 1970s and 1980s, and that irritating Washington a bit. Those are on the scale of, I like to think of the transfer of, putting it in a kind of slightly juvenile way, global leadership moving from London to Washington at some point during the 20th century. As this must have been really irritating for the people in London. But it wasn't more than irritating. I mean, irritation is quite a thing, and it can look like more than irritation, but it isn't really more than irritation. Whereas this is about something much deeper, and that I think will go on for much longer, so long as domestic political stability prevails in both China and in the United States. And one could, I mean, I think all of this comes back to who will make the more significant mistakes, both domestically and internationally. I don't think there's much we can do about each other, as it were, other than try to avoid mistakes ourselves, and symmetrically China trying to avoid mistakes. And actually, they've made quite a few mistakes over recent years.
This is fascinating. Of course, it also raises questions about the sustainability of both America and China. But let's leave that aside for a moment. Happy to come back to that in a second. But I'd briefly like to go back to the 18th and I suppose also the 19th century. I'm intrigued here by this kind of comparison of how Britain and France dealt with each other in the 18th century. But I wonder whether if we go to the immediate post-1815 period, whether we could even find inspiration for your ideas, for your model, that is even more positive, in the sense that it seems to me when you write about 1815, you mostly really talk about the Vienna Congress.
Yeah.
But if we look at the world, I suppose, of rather Paris 1815 and after, the world as is described in Fighting Terror After Napoleon by Beatrice de Graaf, and all the work that she, the evidence she found about how the inter-allied council was functioning, and how basically a number of major powers in the face of an existential threat against all expectations managed to find common ground, at least, and make this sustainable at least for a while, to find some institutional structure for it, and also base that on common values. I wonder whether that provides an even more hopeful vision. But of course, then the question is do we need a similar common existential threat as immediate before 1815 for that to happen? And if that is the case, then the question is what is that threat? Is that threat maybe not a particular country, but is that, for instance, the threat posed by AI or similar technology that will just ultimately force China and the United States to come together and to come up with the same kind of similar, trying to figure out new rules of the game as happened in 1815 and after?
This is a really wonderful question. For what it's worth, I think it's the process you're describing. I think it is more likely to work through some countries having a perception of common jeopardy, if I can put it like that. I'm trying to broaden it from threat and just rather than among each other's at the level of realpolitik, if you like, rather than how do we deal with AI or climate change. But let me give an illustration. So I mentioned already, and this is why I mentioned it, that the border skirmish between China and India in 2020. What's the first thing that happened after that? That Delhi wanted to revive the Quad. So remember that this was an initiative of Japanese Prime Minister Abe in his first term as Prime Minister before he retired or resigned for a few years because of illness. And Delhi hadn't been keen on it for reasons that we can all see in terms of their historical commitment to not being aligned. And there's the border skirmish, and what's the first thing they do? In a rather typically English way, I'm going to trivialize it, which is, so what was that thing that, let's actually, turns out to be quite a good thing after all. Let's revive the Quad. And I think that anybody who has a taste for reading communiques, and any sane person has a limited taste for reading communiques, one of the more interesting over the past year is the communique of the Quad. So this is India, Japan, the United States, and Australia. And when I read it, this was after my book was published, the latest communique, they've got loads of working groups and covering loads of subjects. And the point is not that this will lead to action on all fronts. It's that people are getting to know each other. My own experience of international organization, it's getting to think and tuning into their own constraints that happens operations, and I was impressed by that. I think it's much more likely to be that that I'm not convinced that it will be that AI, climate change, etc., will be suffice. And of course, I'd like to be wrong about this. Let's be clear. Is when it comes to AI, and this actually applies to digital currencies and all sorts of things, there is a kind of problem of opacity and non-observability. Whereas with what we're familiar with in hard power, satellites basically provided the technology to more or less see what each other were doing, so that verification of agreements, compacts became broadly feasible. There is kind of very little observability or observability that anyone could admit to about what people are actually doing in the cyber world. And when it comes to climate change, I was involved in there was an event in my book, and I said, imagine that you and I and Ulrich, Tom, are advisors to China's leader, and we go and we're admitted, and we see him, and we make, as Chinese officials, and we make some proposals for addressing China's contribution to climate change, and we are sensibly asked what we think the hit to GDP will be, plus actually the direct fiscal costs, and we deliver numbers. And the leader looks to somebody else in the room and says, "How many aircraft carriers is that?" The unit of counting is aircraft carriers. I'm going to assert that that this is that when this is the kind of guns butter thing, but it's not about, it's a kind of higher, there are trade-offs to be made, and different trade-offs can be made in different ways in different political systems. When it's not obvious with digital currencies, I don't want to go down a too techie route, but the kind of things in digital currencies that China can tolerate given its system of government are completely different from things that tolerate digital currency. I can't see how any international agreement can easily be forged on that. Or so I think your illustration about Paris alliance containing France through a common interest, but then it is the Vienna thing still matters, because the crucial thing that happens is a two-stage process. First of all, if you like, pacification after a won war, but then relatively quickly France re-entering the fold, and London and Paris being together. That's an absolutely vital moment. London and Paris being together in not signing up to Metternich's wish that actually, as well as having some kind of thin legitimacy around peaceful coexistence, we actually ought to be all collectively endorsing absolutist monarchy, which Prussia and Moscow and Vienna wanted, and Castlereagh and Paris don't want anything to do with that. I think that's an absolutely vital moment. The war has been won, and France has been kind of pacified in some sense, and then let back into the fold, and quite quickly finds itself in alliance on policy with Britain against Metternich, and everyone goes their own way for a while. Of course, this is completely different from what happened after the First World War. So I think there's a lot to be learned from episodes which seem by our distant predecessors to have been handled quite well in incredibly difficult circumstances.
I agree, but I think also what some recent research has shown is that maybe the going different ways between, let's say, Britain and France on the one hand, and Prussia, Austria, and Russia on the other hand, was maybe not quite as extreme as we believed for a long time. if we only look at the kind of the headline of general principles of government, that beyond that principle, there was far more cooperation, far more collaboration, and far more a sense of common values than we long assumed. But I'd like to maybe briefly come back to the question of where we are heading, because of course so much of this is based on the assumption, as you've said yourself, that the United States is sustainable and that China is sustainable. And I know that we're in a way looking here into a crystal ball, but in a way I would still kind of invite you, if you wish, to look into the Chinese crystal ball and share with us your thoughts as to the sustainability of the Chinese model.
I think the party has shown extraordinary resolution and aptitude for sustaining their system. It was graphically illustrated on our television screens in 1989. They showed that there were limits to what they were prepared to do, and that they didn't give way domestically, and could stick to a course over a number of years. This all goes to, I mean, I thought, for what it's worth, Tom, and I claim no credit for this, and this may have been informed biographically by living in Hong Kong for a while in 1987 and 1988. In the early 90s, when the attitude of Western capitals was, oh, China is liberalizing economically and therefore will liberalize politically, it wasn't that I thought that was zero probability. Of course it wasn't. But I did think it was most peculiar to put effectively nearly all of our chips on it. Not quite all of our chips, because during the same period, the United States slightly strengthened its security ties in other parts of East Asia. But after 1989, where Deng was leading, and the same man was liberalizing, well, it wasn't obvious that the party wanted political liberalization to come from economic liberalization. Why on earth should they, in terms of their own interests? And I thought we went down. I don't think we should have tried to. In a sense, we were naive about the terms of entry into WTO, allowing themselves to self-designate as a developing country and so on. And I think my a kind of minimax approach to policy suggests that we should plan on the basis that it does sustain itself. And equally, I think, by the way, in Beijing, a minimax approach suggests that they should plan upon the United States getting through its problems. If you make this into a kind of just into a struggle, I think it's more than that. You should let the unraveling of the other side come as a surprise rather than as a planning assumption. Planning assumption on each side should be that the other side sustains it itself. I think the question about the United States, and you may not want to go down this, is, so I'll just flag.
Sure, go for it.
I think the question about the United States poses itself in its most for Europe. And I could say something about that if
yes,
you,
please.
if
please.
you wish.
Please do.
So, and actually this does go back to economic type things. I mean, European capitals for some while have kind of been irritated times by the way Washington uses the power of the dollar. And that has prompted European initiatives to kind of find ways of conducting commerce without the great dollar infrastructure that kind of dominates the world payment system. And that's completely understandable. But it's also a truth that all of us in Europe, certainly including my own country, we live under the security umbrella of the United States. And we are a rich enough part of the world, I mean Europe as a whole, to become a hard power again, a serious hard power, if the need arose. That's probably not the best thing in the world, to have yet another hard power if the United States remains a tolerably sane, in a European sense, liberal place. And so the problem for Europe is that it will probably take decades to become a hard power again, involving some kind of rupture with the United States. You don't want to do anything ex ante that pursues changes geopolitics in a way that may prove unnecessary. On the other hand, I think Europe has occasionally veered a bit too far down that path. On the other hand, if the United States does unravel, Europe will need to do that in a hurry. This is one of the possibly historic significances of the war on Ukraine, is that it's prompting European capitals and European peoples to think more about local security than they have had. And Germany is absolutely fascinating for a Brit in this respect. I mean, it's hard to exaggerate the extent to which British people admire the way that Germany has navigated itself since the Second World War, for all the obvious reasons, in terms of looking backwards without that being paralyzing. But what the initial phase of the war on Ukraine produced, and all about the war, is that Germany didn't instinctively have a confident sense of what was right and wrong. Whereas my country, because it happens to have had a very different history, partly luck, partly luck, is tremendously confident about those things. Yes, this is wrong, and we will support. And the point isn't about my country. I think the debate generated in Germany is potentially of world historic importance in terms of getting, if we to think about European security without thinking about it as rivalry to the United States may be a very positive thing in a context where the United States is likely to be very stretched across the planet for many decades. I've tried to put that in terms that are both comprehensible and not offensive, because it's certainly not meant to be offensive.
I mean, I'm tempted to comment on that.
Yes, please do.
That should not give us a digression from what we are aiming to discuss. But my explanation, and having lived now for so many decades in this country, is that blindness which you might have observed, that stems from a lack of orientation, and also from an absence of world politics, to the sense that we tried to adapt and adopt that new success model of West Germany, and we haven't been able so far to make the right moves after 89, 90. And what you can observe from that strategic mistakes, or that underdevelopment of strategic thinking in this country, and the blindness towards the Russian question, which has also to do with the greediness of some sectors in this country. I think that is an argument in favor of your approach in your book. And we are relatively weak in this country to bring together the different sectors. And if I may ask a question which I had in mind from the very beginning when I saw your thesis and your writings, is, I mean, you are absolutely right in suggesting that we should overcome that thinking in pillars and blocks, and that international cooperation is based on a comprehensive approach. And what I think is so fascinating that you take recipes from one sector and draw conclusions for other sectors. We all have a tendency, and having spent 3 decades in the security sector field in the German Foreign Service. So I think our strategic weakness stems from that absence of thinking broad and of approaching new problems with a new way of thinking. And my question is, when you look back at your own career, is that approach which you suggested now in that book, is that something which you had in mind already in the very beginning, in the early days of your career, or is it to some extent a sum of what you have lived through in your professional life?
Oh, it's a very, very good question. I think the biographical answer is these were thoughts that were developing from the early 2000s, certainly before the financial crisis. And when I was deputy governor in 2009, I tried to revive close relations between the Bank of England and the British Foreign Office. And this was partly for prosaic reasons, which is that I thought one couldn't be fully effective in international negotiations in any field without understanding the local constraints that we're under. But I was also, I was conscious from the early 2000s of the rise of China and believed that it was quite likely, but not certain, to become a major issue. This is the kind of point about compound growth. Yeah. I'm making a completely banal point now that, again, in a rather English way, will sound as though I'm trivializing it, which is China's chugging along at an incredibly fast rate of growth, but actually was still quite small, of course, for a long time. But if you compounded it up, I had the thought a long time ago, well, God, if they sustain that for 15 to 20 years, they'll be enormous. And one thing that did happen in my career, and I probably absorbed this from my bosses, is I thought that 25 years was about the sensible planning horizon for a top central banker. I used to say, making reforms, I used to say to Bank of England staff, of course we're not getting the perfect answer, because not only will circumstances change, but we'll be making mistakes. But we should be aiming for policies that can be robust over a few decades, rather than something that's going to be found wanting in a year or so's time. And that's, by the way, not so unusual. I mean, this would take us far too far afield, but the Federal Reserve did some reforms a few years ago of their monetary policy, which turned out to be flawed within 2 to 3 years, because they were actually only catering for the circumstances that we're immediately in, but declared it as a regime. But I think the bigger point, and I just want to repeat this, is that what you describe, Ulrich, and much of what I experienced, is just a product of peacetime. That where there exists peaceful coexistence, and we can more or less take it for granted, not that the world didn't have local wars and skirmishes, but there wasn't a great danger of some enormous conflagration, particularly after 1989. This is a world where silos are almost the inevitable result of greater specialism and trying to improve things. And one sees it in academia, and one sees it in the policy world, and one sees it in the think tank world, and in newspaper articles. And it's siloism all the way down. When I was in America, you had to know some trade economics, but you didn't need to know anything about trade policy. Whereas actually, I now think that you can't do any of those top jobs in the core organs of the state without knowing a bit about trade policy and a bit about the laws of war and peace, and a bit about environmental policy. And it's not because one should be intervening in everything else, that would be muddle, but you were in one world, I was in another, and something's going on in my world, and I knock on your door and I say, I think there's something going on in my world that's relevant for you. And I describe it, and it's mumbo jumbo, and you want to wave me aside because it sounds ridiculous economic stuff. And I need to be able to say, no, it's relevant to you because of this, and I need to know just enough about your world, be sensitive to when I should alert you to something, and be capable of persuading you against your things. That that is not where the government machines of any of the great Western capitals are. And I think if you go back many decades when the world was riskier, I think there was much more sensitivity to colleagues in different parts of government.
Absolutely, and it's complacent to live in a world of silos.
Yes.
I mean, what I have observed in my professional life is that also the characters of the central bankers have changed tremendously in a period of 30 or 40 years or so. I think there we see now a different type of central banker than we used to see in the 1980s and 1990s.
I happen to think that too. But the bigger point, I think, here is it's not just being comfortable with or complacent about silos. Behind that, and the two guiding spirits of the book are David Hume and the late moral and political philosopher Bernard Williams. And Bernard Williams describes as the first political question, the question of order and safety and protection, degrees of trust, which are preconditions for cooperation of any kind, locally, domestically, internationally. And taking order for granted is the original sin here. It's order. I mean, the fact that I'm going down to Yale later today, and I'll leave this building and go to the station and take the train, and I'm not worried at all about my safety in doing so.
Mm.
This is an achievement. Is an achievement, and in the sense that it's the prosaic version of taking order for granted. And if I go back to Tom's first question, I mean, I think and we each achieve order in different ways in our states, with a different set of legitimation norms and variants on our institutions. And this is true for other parts of the world. It's not just a Western thing. And I think that our peaceful coexistence aside, in a way, I think that our participation in international regimes and organizations can't sensibly put at risk the legitimation norms at home that hold things together. The kind of one of the key, I think, analytical moves in the book is you have a set of legitimation norms locally that are partly historically contingent, and you have a set of legitimation norms among states in the good times as well as, and those can potentially be in tension. And there's a problem here, and we've seen this in Britain, I think we see it in the United States, but it's not limited to those two Anglo-Saxon countries, that it has suited elected politicians, and there's no criticism here, to kind of draw a veil over international initiatives. I mean, I was involved in my old life, I was involved in the biggest reforms after the global financial crisis. And one of the small group of sponsoring senators in the United States, a good man, said to me, of course, we realize that what we're taking through Congress is largely modeled on the international agreement. You just have to understand that we can't describe it that way. and that makes perfect sense as a tactical decision in the short run. But it's terribly corrosive in the medium to long run, because it leaves people, the public commentators, with the impression that actually everything has been created at home. And this is no different in Europe. I spoke a few years ago at the Cercle des Économistes, the thing that happens in Aix-en-Provence. This was the year of Brexit as it happened. And I said, you know, one of the changes that might usefully be made in the EU would be televising the legislative sessions of the Council of Ministers. Because at the moment, representatives of the member states could take one line in behind closed doors at the council and then return home and take a subtly different line. Oh, well, you know, we pushed this through if it was good, or we had to overcome the kind of obstructionism of then make up some state. In England, it was often France. Whereas actually, that wasn't always accurate. So I said this in one of the larger fora, and I got the closest I will ever come to a standing ovation in my professional life. But the French people there recognized it as a problem with France. It's completely natural. And so that's another example, this time local to Europe, of the lack of transparency about what actually goes on in international regimes, in this case a regional regime. In the short run is understandable, but in the long run is costly. And I think, and I try to do in my book, is try to explain this. Well, of course, you're bound to have that tension because there can be a conflict or tension between local norms and international norms, because in a sense they've been generated by responses to different kinds of problem.
I think it's interesting here how you focus on the necessity of order, and maybe also that it's a fault to take order for granted. But I mean, I guess what's linked to that, and which you've already alluded to by talking about trust, is that it's also based on an assumption that both domestically but also internationally there is a minimum existence of what one may call pre-political values, where there'll be trust, reliability, candor, and so on. And I suppose the question is, this is more a comment or an editorializing rather than a real question, is where does this all leave us if there is a crisis, first of all, at home for these kind of value for these kind of pre-political values, where trust is corroding within our societies, where networks of trust are breaking down, but also internationally, how is then trust possible if even domestically we can't get our act together and our kind of political values and trust networks are breaking down?
Well, Tom, you're plumbing the deeper depths of the book in a way, which is that in a kind of clumsy way of stating the point, I don't really think there are pre-political values thereon. I think that inform and underpin politics are endogenous to politics, but ones that we then internalize and on reflection endorse as values that we are committed to. But in their origin, I think that they are kind of local and part of the product of politics as well as enabling politics. This, of course, is Hume versus Kant.
Sure.
But all debates ultimately come back to Hume and Kant, at least in the Western world. And actually, one of the interesting things about the rise of China is that it is kind of pushing us back to looking at the history of virtue ethics in our own continent. But notwithstanding that kind of rather Olympian view on the nature of the problem, you're of course right. And another way of thinking about this, a way that I find congenial, is the distinction between kind of thicker values and thinner values, thin values being good, bad, right, wrong, which these are concepts that are used everywhere, but people disagree about how to use them. Whereas thicker concepts are kind of very local, the way we use the word cruel or something like that. And it is, the reason this matters is that the international cooperation and regimes almost inevitably pushes us towards thin values. We don't share a history that leads us to share many thick values. And the more distant we have been, and often things geographically, the thinner the international regimes will be. And that can clash with the way people make sense of their domestic way of life. So it's just not very helpful to say to people, well, of course, liberal trade is good for economic efficiency. And because they may say, well, actually, it's completely upended my community and our way of life. Now, I've got to get Kiwi corners in the way I say that. And the challenge for our political leaders is I mean, and it's an enormous challenge, is how to navigate between these two things. That the advantages of international cooperation to addressing shared problems and sometimes shared opportunities, which is what trade is, without losing the glue that holds broader sense of. I think that parts of the West have been casual about local legitimation, and you know that is playing out in our domestic politics. But on the other hand, if we all turn our backs on international cooperation, we will end up poorer in all sorts of senses, and the people will then ask us what on earth we've been doing.
Absolutely. May I ask whether there are any questions or comments amongst our very patient audience?
Well, I must confess, I'm wandering.
Wayne, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Wayne Tabrak. I'm in New York, not so far away from you, Paul. I am a European historian who's concerned with that very concept that's critical to you, peaceful coexistence, but in a very different sense, understanding the way competitive, contentious religious communities can learn to live together. And I'm wondering if you could say something more about what you mean by peaceful coexistence and what brings it into being. What are the sources of peaceful coexistence? What are the mechanisms that make that come about?
That's a question. Very nice to meet you to start with, and thank you for your. On the first part of my answer, I think I just follow the literature in a sense that it's either a balance of power or hegemony, but in both cases, kind of generating a set of norms that make sense to the different parties, and with lesser states needing to find an accommodation in some way. And I think a tremendously important part of all of this is, I think, the capacity to resist actively or passively to a prevailing regime, domestically or internationally, is tremendously important. Mm-hmm. And technology, in the broadest sense of technology, has done and continues to do so far, is broaden the population of potential resistors who get a voice because they can resist. And by resistance, what I really mean is actively or passively doing things that reduce the returns to being at the top table, reduce the returns, actually reduce the risk-adjusted returns to being the ruler or the government or at the top table for in the international sphere. And I think one of the mistakes, looking back, for Washington is that I think Washington didn't realize that if you're going to be the hegemon, that actually means being interested in almost every part of the world. Doesn't mean dominating every part of the world. It means considering every part of the world, partly because eventually some coalition of states or some rival power will emerge, and one's going to need all the friends one can get. I mean, my three maxims of policy in this area include bit of de-risking, one, which we've talked about, avoid unnecessary mistakes. So I think, the little banking failures in the US and in Europe earlier this year are grim mistakes because we can't afford another financial crisis. But the third, and in some respects, certainly important, is make sure you've got plenty of friends everywhere, and reduce the number of your enemies by creating unnecessary enemies. I mean, I think Washington on this. So when I first started, Tom asked me, or Ulrich asked me when I first started thinking about this, and I guess it was the early zeros. And one thought I had is, the future of the world is going to turn on India and Latin America, which I still think actually, although I'm in Confucian East Asian states, which I hadn't had enough at the time. And I think Washington has not handled Latin America well over the past century. And that didn't matter very much when they were small and struggling. They were to become a success. And one of the things that we've learned from China, and maybe learning from India, and actually, of course, should learn from ourselves, is that it is possible to be a success and to thrive.
Yeah. I wonder if you could address the question of the sources of our global discord, or what, I can't remember the title now. Global, is it discord?
Yeah.
Because so many of those are domestic as opposed to international, and also the way your discussion has proceeded is largely talking about state actors as opposed to non-state actors. Yeah. And you opened up the discussion of non-state actors when you talked about domestic tranquility and the potential for resistance, and the question of being able to limit the autocracy of the state and things like that within states. But how do non-state actors, play a role in your vision of what the world could be and possibly should be?
In the most elemental sense, I think that the people, particularly people who can resist, and in liberal states, I mean liberal in the European sense, in our kind of states, everybody can resist a bit. If only passively. And therefore the legitimation of our own, legitimacy of our own way of life, of constitutional democracy, depends upon nearly everybody in our state. That taking anyone for granted is, or thinking that they will remain irrelevant materially, is just a mistake. And I think, even a headline level, kind of schoolboy knowledge, schoolgirl knowledge of the history of China, we find the same there. The mandate of heaven metaphor is about, be careful not to lose the people. And, so I think the people are more important than NGOs, actually.
Yeah.
Because I think NGOs, I'm not against NGOs for goodness sake, but I think NGOs, rather like multinational corporations, are essentially bundles of interests.
Mm-hmm.
And, not always unidirectional, but inclined in direction. I think people in their manifold, wonderful complexity are kind of have a much richer view of things. I'm not somebody who follows the literature that thinks the people are utterly stupid and don't have any sensible views on things, and democracy is a sham. I actually genuinely think that doesn't tune into what regular people are like.
And I genuinely think that we consistently overestimate the power of autocracy. And for example, you've referenced the skill of the Communist Party in negotiating the last few decades, but I think we underestimate the strength throughout the history of China, of the people vis-a-vis the autocratic state.
Yeah.
And that power has been demonstrated over and over historically.
I agree with that. But let me provide a peg for a hopeful thing.
Yes.
What's wonderful about our is that what democracy, constitutional democracy does is it separates how we feel about the people governing us just now from how we feel about the system of government.
Yes.
And this is in kind of the terms that economists would use, this makes the system more resilient. We can kick out our rulers without junking the system. And in that sense, the Chinese system is more brittle, because it would be hard to get rid of the party without getting rid of the system of government. And so I think this is, my book ends with a kind of we mustn't lose faith in our system. In fact, my bottom line is we must hang on to who we have managed to become. Our generation doesn't take any credit for it, but we will deserve the blame if actually we let go of this kind of achievement that somehow grew over a few centuries, and that will be the best advertisement for the rest of the world. I think the soft power people kind of have a point, but it means that we need to be very attentive to our domestic circumstances, and that's probably a bit more difficult and a bit more urgent now than it seemed 20 years ago.
Absolutely fascinating. I'm afraid we're out of time, so all I really have left to say is to thank Sir Paul Tucker for a wonderfully illuminating and inspiring discussion, which I hope will continue in Bonn as well as elsewhere. And I also look forward to continuing discussion with one of our guests today, with Wayne te Braak, who will be the speaker in one of our future global conversations on religious peace. But for now, thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.
Yeah. You can still stay in.